My parents spent my entire childhood treating my brother like the golden child and me like a servant. 20 years later, they showed up at my door begging for the success they said I'd never have. People always say parents love all their children equally. Mine didn't. If you had walked into our house when I was 10 years old, you would have thought my older brother, Ethan, was an only child. Every family photo had him standing proudly in the middle while I was shoved to the side. Every birthday was about him. Every achievement was his. And every mistake somehow became mine. My earliest memory wasn't of being hugged. It was of standing on a chair in our kitchen washing dishes because Ethan had homework. I was 7. He was 9. Funny thing was, he wasn't doing homework. He was outside riding his brand new bicycle, the one my parents bought him after he got a B+ on a math test. 3 weeks earlier, I'd gotten straight A's. Dad looked at my report card for exactly 5 seconds. Good. That's what you're supposed to do. Then he tossed it on the counter without another word. No congratulations. No hug. No reward. That night Ethan came home with his report card. Mostly BS. 1C. Mom wrapped him in a hug. We're so proud of you. You tried your best. Dad smiled. Let's celebrate. They ordered pizza. My favorite food. Except, I wasn't allowed to eat until I finished cleaning the kitchen. By the time I sat down, there were only 2 cold slices left. I kept telling myself things would get better. Kids always think adults know something they don't. I believed if I worked harder, if I behaved better, if I earned better grades, eventually my parents would notice me. Instead, the harder I worked, the more invisible I became. When I turned 12, Mom handed me a handwritten chore schedule. Not chores, responsibilities. Morning dishes, laundry, vacuuming, cooking dinner twice a week, cleaning both bathrooms every Saturday, taking out trash every night, mowing the lawn, washing Dad's car, walking the dog. I stared at the paper. What does Ethan have to do? Mom laughed. He needs to focus on school. I blinked. So do I. She folded her arms. Don't compare yourself to your brother. That sentence became the soundtrack of my childhood. Whenever Ethan forgot to clean his room, I was punished. You should have reminded him. Whenever he broke something, you probably distracted him. Whenever he failed a test, you should have helped him study. Whenever I accomplished something, silence. At 13, I won first place in the regional science competition. Hundreds of students. Weeks of preparation. The winner received a trophy and a small scholarship. I couldn't stop smiling as I carried it home. Dad looked up from the television. What's that? I won. He shrugged. Good. That was it. 5 letters. Good. 30 seconds later, Ethan walked through the door, holding a participation ribbon from a local soccer tournament. Mom screamed with excitement. Oh my goodness. She hugged him. Dad stood up clapping. Our future athlete. They framed his ribbon. My trophy stayed in a cardboard box in the garage. The favoritism wasn't subtle. It wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. At family gatherings, my grandparents would ask about school. Before I could answer, Mom interrupted. Ethan scored a goal this weekend. If relatives complimented my grades, Dad always found a way to redirect the conversation. Academics are easy. Sports build character. Except Ethan wasn't even good at sports. He just enjoyed them. Apparently enjoyment mattered more than achievement. The older we got, the worse it became. When Ethan turned 16, he got a brand new car. A shiny blue sedan. Mom cried, handing him the keys. You deserve this. 2 years later, I turned 16. Dad tossed me a used bicycle helmet. Your bike still works. It had 3 flat tires. Money was always tight. Unless Ethan wanted something. Gaming console? Bought. Football camp? Paid. Designer clothes? No problem. I asked if I could join the robotics club. The fee was $100. Dad laughed. What a waste. That same weekend, he spent nearly $2,000 upgrading Ethan's car stereo. One evening, I finally asked the question I'd carried for years. Why do you love Ethan more than me? The room went silent. Mom slowly put down her coffee. We don't. It doesn't feel that way. Dad slammed his newspaper onto the table. You're imagining things. I do all the chores. So? He gets everything. He earned it. I have better grades. Dad's face darkened. Grades don't mean you'll succeed in life. He pointed a finger directly at me. You spend too much time with books. Then came the sentence I would never forget. People like you grow up to work for people like Ethan. Mom nodded without hesitation. Your brother has leadership. You. She looked me up and down. We're born to support others. The words hit harder than any slap. I remember staring at both of them, waiting, hoping one of them would smile and admit it was a joke. Neither did. That night, I sat alone in my tiny bedroom. The trophy from the science competition sat on my desk, covered in dust. I picked it up, looked at my reflection in the gold-colored metal, then whispered something to myself. One day, I'll prove every single one of you wrong. Not for revenge, not for recognition, but because I refuse to believe the rest of my life has already been decided by people who never truly saw me. I didn't know it then, but that promise would become the reason I survived everything that came next. And before I finally walked away from that house forever, my own family would betray me in a way I never imagined. The promise I made to myself that night changed everything. If no one in my family believed in me, then I would have to believe in myself. I threw everything I had into school. While Ethan spent weekends at parties, I spent mine in the library. While he slept until noon, I woke up before sunrise to study. I wasn't trying to beat him anymore. I was trying to escape, because by the time I was 16, I had realized something terrifying. I wasn't a son in my parents' eyes. I was unpaid labor. Every day followed the same routine. Wake up at 5:30, make breakfast for everyone, pack Dad's lunch, iron Ethan's school uniform because, according to Mom, he's too busy, wash the dishes, go to school, come home, cook dinner, clean the house, finish homework after everyone else had gone to bed. Most nights I didn't fall asleep until after midnight. Then I'd wake up 5 hours later and do it all again. If I complained, Dad would glare at me. You live under this roof. You earn your keep. The strange part? Ethan never had to earn anything. One Friday afternoon, my guidance counselor, Mrs. Reynolds, asked me to stay after class. She smiled as she handed me a thick envelope. I've been waiting weeks for this. I looked down. The logo belonged to one of the best engineering academies in the state. My hands trembled. Inside was an acceptance letter, along with something even more unbelievable. A full academic scholarship. Tuition, books, housing, almost everything covered. Mrs. Reynolds actually had tears in her eyes. You've worked harder than almost any student I've ever taught. You earned this. For the first time in years, an adult looked proud of me. I walked home feeling lighter than air. Maybe, just maybe, my life was finally changing. Mom was in the kitchen when I burst through the front door. I got in. She barely looked up. Into what? The engineering academy. Silence. Dad walked into the room. What academy? I handed him the letter. He read it. His expression never changed. Then he folded it in half. So, I got a full scholarship. He tossed it onto the table. You'll stay here. I blinked. What? We need you. I'll be living on campus. No. I earned this. Dad's voice became ice cold. I said no. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It's my future. Dad stepped closer. Your future is helping this family. I looked at Mom. She wouldn't even meet my eyes. Instead, she quietly said, Who will take care of the house if you leave? For a second, I thought I'd misunderstood. You mean, the chores? She nodded. Ethan can't do everything. I almost laughed. He doesn't do anything now. The slap came so fast I never saw it. My cheek burned. Dad lowered his hand. Don't disrespect your brother. That night, I called Mrs. Reynolds from a payphone. I explained everything. She was quiet for a long moment. Finally, she asked, "Do your parents understand what this opportunity means?" "They don't care. They'll change their minds." I wanted to believe her. I really did. A week later, she came to our house. I listened from the hallway. She explained the scholarship, the career opportunities, the internships, the salaries graduates often earned. Everything. When she finished, Dad leaned back in his chair. "My older son will be the successful one." Mrs. Reynolds frowned. "But your younger son earned this." Dad shrugged. "Good for him. But he isn't leaving." She looked genuinely shocked. "This could change his life." Dad smiled. "He doesn't need his own life. He has responsibilities here." Mrs. Reynolds stood up slowly. "I've taught for 28 years. I've never seen parents refuse a full scholarship." Dad crossed his arms. "Then today is your lucky day." She left looking heartbroken. Before getting into her car, she looked at me standing in the doorway. "I'm so sorry." Those 4 words hurt more than anything, because they confirmed what I had spent years trying to deny. This wasn't normal. A month later, another letter arrived. This one contained instructions for enrollment. I never got to read it. Mom opened it first. That evening, she placed the papers in front of me. "I already declined." I froze. "What?" "I mailed the refusal yesterday." The room spun. "You? What?" "You weren't listening. I declined your place." I grabbed the envelope. The acceptance was gone. Only a carbon copy of the rejection remained. Signed, with my name. Forged. "You forged my signature." Mom didn't even deny it. "It was for your own good." I stared at her in disbelief. "You stole my future." She sighed as though I were being unreasonable. "No. I protected this family." Something inside me broke that day. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Quietly. Like a rope stretched too far finally snapping. For the next several weeks, I stopped arguing. Stopped explaining. Stopped hoping. I simply existed. My parents mistook my silence for obedience. They had no idea. I was planning my escape. I got a part-time job at a grocery store after school. Dad thought the money was going toward house expenses. Instead, I secretly opened a bank account. Every paycheck went into it. I skipped lunch to save money. Walked everywhere instead of taking the bus. Repaired my own shoes with glue because I couldn't afford new ones. Every dollar meant one step closer to freedom. Meanwhile, Ethan's life kept getting easier. He dropped out of community college after 1 semester. "It was boring," he announced. Dad laughed. "College isn't for everyone." Mom immediately started looking for jobs through her friends. Within 2 weeks, Dad had used one of his business contacts to get Ethan a comfortable office position. No interview, no qualifications, just connections. That night, they celebrated with steak and cake. Dad raised a glass. "Here's to my successful son." I quietly ate instant noodles in the kitchen after washing everyone's dishes. A few months later, I learned something that changed my life forever. Not because it gave me hope, but because it showed me just how far my parents were willing to go to keep Ethan on his throne. I accidentally overheard a conversation between Mom and Dad late one night. A conversation that revealed they had been secretly using my name for something I had never agreed to. And when I discovered the truth, I realized escaping that house wouldn't be enough. I would have to fight for the life they had already started stealing. After overhearing my parents that night, I barely slept. Their voices kept echoing in my head. Dad sounded irritated. "I told you not to use his name unless we absolutely had to." Mom answered without the slightest hint of guilt. "We didn't have a choice. Ethan needed the money." Dad sighed. "As long as he never finds out." I stood frozen in the hallway. Use my name? For what? The floor creaked beneath my foot. The conversation stopped instantly. I hurried back to my room before either of them opened the door. But I already knew one thing. Whatever they had done, it involved me, and they had never intended for me to know. The next afternoon, I skipped lunch and walked to the local bank where I had secretly opened my savings account. I checked my balance. Still there. Every dollar I had earned from stocking shelves at the grocery store remained untouched. So it wasn't my savings. Then what had they used my name for? The question haunted me for days. A week later, the answer came by accident. When I got home from school, there was an envelope sitting on the dining table. It had my name on it. Dad wasn't home. Mom was upstairs. I picked it up. The return address belonged to a finance company. Curious, I opened it. My stomach dropped. It wasn't a letter. It was a payment reminder. A loan payment reminder. Borrower's name. My name. Outstanding balance. Nearly $18,000. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I read the page again. Then again. There had to be some mistake. I had never borrowed money. Never signed anything. Never even applied for a loan. Yet, according to the documents, I was responsible for every cent. The front door opened. Dad walked in. He immediately saw the papers in my hands. His face changed. "What are you doing?" My voice shook. "What is this?" He snatched the papers away. "Nothing you need to worry about. My name is on it." "So? I never borrowed $18,000. Dad looked annoyed rather than ashamed. "We handled it." "You forged my signature?" He didn't answer. That silence told me everything. Mom walked downstairs carrying a basket of laundry. She noticed the argument and frowned. "What's going on?" "He found out," Dad muttered. Mom looked at me. Then, unbelievably, she rolled her eyes. "You weren't supposed to open that." I stared at her. "You're upset because I opened it?" "It was for Ethan." She said it as though that explained everything. Ethan needed a reliable borrower. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "So you committed fraud." Mom crossed her arms. "Don't use dramatic words." "Dramatic? You stole my identity." Dad slammed his fist on the table. "Lower your voice." For the first time in my life, I didn't. "No!" I shouted louder than I ever had before. "You forged my signature. You rejected my scholarship. You've treated me like a servant my entire life. And now you've put me in debt so Ethan could spend money he didn't earn?" Dad's face turned red. "You owe this family. I owe you nothing." The room fell silent. Mom looked genuinely offended. "After everything we've done for you?" I laughed. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was the kind that escaped when reality became too absurd. "What exactly have you done for me?" Neither of them answered, because they couldn't. That evening Ethan came home. He walked into the middle of the argument carrying shopping bags full of expensive clothes. "What's going on?" Dad pointed at me. "Your brother is being ungrateful." Ethan sighed dramatically. "Seriously?" He looked at me like I was the problem. "It's just a loan. You'll pay it off eventually." I stared at him. "You knew." He shrugged. "Mom and Dad said you wouldn't mind." I couldn't even recognize the person standing in front of me anymore. This was my own brother. The boy I'd covered for. The boy whose chores I'd done. The boy I'd defended when other kids bullied him. He had known all along, and he hadn't cared. That night I packed a small backpack. Not because I was ready to leave, because I knew the day was coming. Inside were my school certificates, my science competition trophy, a few clothes, the cash I'd saved, and one notebook. In that notebook I wrote down everything. Every slap, every insult, every forged document, every unfair punishment, every date I could remember. If they ever tried to deny what they had done, I'd have a record. A month later, something unexpected happened. Mrs. Reynolds called me into her office again. "I've been trying to reach you." "I know. I also know why you didn't enroll." I looked down. She slid another envelope across the desk. "This isn't the same scholarship. It's something different." I slowly opened it. A private foundation had heard about my situation through her. They were offering emergency financial assistance. Enough to cover housing, books, living expenses, everything. There was only one condition. I had to leave home immediately and start classes within 2 weeks. Felt unreal. A second chance. The kind most people never get. Mrs. Reynolds smiled gently. You earned this. But if you stay. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. I already knew. If I stayed, I'd spend the rest of my life cleaning up after Ethan while paying off a debt that wasn't even mine. For the first time, escape wasn't just a dream. It was possible. I looked at the acceptance papers, then out the classroom window, and I made the decision that would change every single one of our lives. I was leaving, even if it meant never speaking to my parents again. I just didn't realize that when they discovered I was gone, they would do something so cruel that it would follow me for years, and make the day they eventually showed up begging at my front door far more satisfying than I could ever imagine. I spent the next 2 weeks pretending nothing had changed. I still woke up before sunrise, still cooked breakfast, still cleaned the bathrooms, still ironed Ethan's clothes, still listened as my parents praised him for doing absolutely nothing. The only difference was, inside I was already gone. Every free minute, I quietly prepared for my escape. Mrs. Reynolds and the Scholarship Foundation helped me find a small room near campus. It wasn't fancy, a single bed, a desk, and a tiny window overlooking a parking lot, but to me, it looked like freedom. I signed the paperwork in secret, opened a new bank account at a different bank, transferred every dollar I had saved, changed my mailing address. For the first time in my life, I was making decisions for myself. 3 days before I was supposed to leave, Dad handed me another list of chores. It was twice as long as usual. Since Ethan has plans this weekend, you'll mow the lawn, clean the garage, wash both cars, repaint the fence, and organize the basement. I looked at the list, then at him. I won't be here this weekend. He frowned. What do you mean? I have somewhere to be. He laughed. No, you don't. For years, that sentence would have ended the conversation. This time, it didn't. Yes, I said calmly. I do. He narrowed his eyes. Don't test me. I simply folded the list and placed it back on the table. I won't be doing it. The silence was deafening. Dad slowly stood up. I said you'll do it. No. One word. Just one. But it was the first time I had ever truly refused him. His face turned crimson. Before he could speak, Mom rushed into the room. What's happening? Your son thinks he can say no. She looked at me with disappointment. Don't start acting rebellious. I took a deep breath. I'm moving out. For a moment, neither of them reacted. Then, they both laughed. Actually laughed. Dad wiped tears from his eyes. With what money? Mom smiled. You can't even afford rent. I looked at them quietly. I already have a place. Their smiles disappeared. What are you talking about? Dad demanded. I accepted another scholarship. Mom's face went pale. You? What? I leave in 3 days. Dad slammed his hand against the wall. I already told you you're not leaving. You don't get to decide that anymore. I am your father, and I'm legally an adult. The words hit him like a punch. For the first time, he realized he couldn't control me forever. That evening, they tried a different approach. Mom knocked on my bedroom door. She hadn't done that in years. When I opened it, she was holding a plate of my favorite cookies. The same cookies she hadn't baked for me since I was a child. Can we talk? I nodded cautiously. She sat on the edge of my bed. We know things haven't always been perfect. That was the closest she had ever come to admitting anything. But families stay together. I stayed silent. She reached for my hand. If you leave, who will help us? Not, we'll miss you. Not, we love you. Not, we're sorry. Her biggest concern was losing the person who cooked, cleaned, repaired, and sacrificed. In that moment, every last bit of hope I had been holding on to disappeared. I gently pulled my hand away. You don't need me. You have Ethan. Her eyes filled with panic. He doesn't know how to do those things. I know. She whispered. Please. I shook my head. For once. Ask your favorite son. The morning I left, I woke up before anyone else. One final time. Not to cook breakfast. Not to clean. Just to leave. I picked up my backpack, my suitcase, and the small box containing my certificates and science trophy. I stood in the living room for a long moment. This house had never truly felt like home. It was just the place where I had learned what it felt like to be unwanted. I quietly placed a single envelope on the dining table. Inside was a handwritten letter. I spent my entire childhood trying to earn your love. I finally realized love shouldn't have to be earned. You always said Ethan would lead and I would serve. Today I'm choosing a different future. Don't look for me. Goodbye. I closed the front door behind me, without looking back. By noon, my phone was exploding. 23 missed calls. 14 text messages. Dad, come home immediately. Mom, you're being selfish. Ethan, Mom is crying because of you. I read every message, then turned my phone off. For the first time in my life, the silence felt peaceful. College wasn't easy. I attended classes all day, worked evenings at a bookstore, studied until 2 in the morning. There were weeks when I survived on instant noodles and peanut butter sandwiches. Some nights I cried from exhaustion. But every difficult day came with something I had never experienced before. Freedom. No one yelled if I sat down for 5 minutes. No one ordered me to clean someone else's mess. No one told me my dreams didn't matter. Every success belonged to me. Every failure was mine to overcome. And strangely, that made me happier than I had ever been. Months turned into years. I graduated near the top of my class. One internship became a full-time job. That job became a better one. Then another. My salary doubled. Then doubled again. I quietly built the life my parents had insisted I would never have. I never contacted them. They never apologized. As far as I knew, our story was over. Until one rainy Tuesday evening. I was leaving work when my phone rang from an unknown number. I almost ignored it. Something made me answer. A familiar voice spoke through the speaker. Soft, fragile, almost desperate. Please. It was my mother. And for the first time in 20 years, she sounded like the one begging. I almost hung up the moment I heard my mother's voice. For 20 years, nothing. No birthday calls. No holiday messages. No congratulations when I graduated. No apology. Not even a simple, "How are you?" Then suddenly, she remembered my phone number. "Hello?" she whispered again. I didn't answer. She took my silence as permission to keep talking. "I know I don't deserve your time." No, she didn't. I need to talk to you." I finally spoke. "What happened to Ethan?" The silence on the other end lasted several seconds. Then she quietly said, "How did you know?" Because if my brother had been successful, she never would have called me. We agreed to meet the following afternoon at a small cafe halfway between my office and her town. I arrived 10 minutes early, not because I was excited, because I wanted to prepare myself. The woman who walked through the door barely resembled my mother. Her hair, once carefully dyed every month, was almost completely gray. The expensive clothes she used to wear had been replaced with faded, worn-out fabric. She looked older than her age. Tired. Defeated. For a split second, I almost felt sorry for her. Then I remembered the forged scholarship rejection. The loan in my name. The years of being treated like a servant. The sympathy disappeared. She sat across from me. For nearly a minute, neither of us spoke. Finally, she smiled weakly. "You've changed." "So have you." She looked down at the table. "I've seen pictures." I frowned. "What pictures?" "You're successful." I didn't respond. She nervously stirred a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. "You own your own company now." So, that was why she was here. Not because she missed me. Because she'd been keeping track of my success. "I didn't come here to fight," she said. "I came because—" She swallowed hard. "We need your help." There it was. The real reason. I leaned back in my chair. "What happened?" She took a shaky breath. "Ethan's business failed." I wasn't surprised. He borrowed money. How much? She hesitated. A lot. How much? She finally whispered the number. Almost $2 million. I blinked. 2 million. I had expected bad. Not catastrophic. She explained everything. After I left home, my parents poured everything into Ethan. They paid for his business, bought him equipment, co-signed loans, mortgaged their house, sold Dad's retirement investments. Every time his business struggled, they gave him more money. Every time he failed, they blamed someone else. The economy, his employees, his partners, his competition. Never Ethan. Never the man who refused to work hard because he'd spent his entire life believing the world owed him success. Eventually, the business collapsed. The banks demanded repayment. Creditors sued. The house was gone. Dad's retirement savings, gone. Mom's jewelry, sold. Even the cars had been repossessed. What about Ethan? I asked. She looked away. He left. I wasn't sure I'd heard correctly. He what? He moved overseas. And left you with the debt? Tears rolled down her face. He said he needed a fresh start. The irony was almost unbelievable. The golden child had abandoned the very parents who spent decades sacrificing everything for him. I tried calling him, she whispered. He doesn't answer. Dad. He had a stroke last year. I stayed quiet. He's alive, but he can't work anymore. She wiped her eyes. We're renting a tiny apartment. I clean offices at night. I'm 70 years old. Again, for a brief moment, I felt that dangerous emotion creeping back. Pity. Then another memory surfaced. People like you grow up to work for people like Ethan. Dad's voice echoed perfectly in my mind. The feeling vanished. Mom reached across the table. I know we made mistakes. Mistakes. Interesting. Choice of words. A mistake is forgetting someone's birthday. A mistake is burning dinner. You didn't make mistakes. You made choices. She lowered her head. I know. No. I don't think you do. I looked directly into her eyes. You chose Ethan every single day. You chose to reject my scholarship. You chose to forge my signature. You chose to put me into debt. You chose to tell me I'd never amount to anything. Each sentence made her shoulders sink lower. Finally, she whispered the question she'd been building toward all afternoon. Could you help us? I already knew what she meant. Money, of course. Not forgiveness. Money. My company is doing very well, I admitted. Her eyes lit up. For the first time since she'd arrived, she smiled. I knew it. I knew you'd become successful. I almost laughed. No, you didn't. 20 years earlier, they had guaranteed I would fail. Now they wanted to rewrite history. I never stopped believing in you, she said quietly. That sentence made something inside me snap. I reached into my briefcase, pulled out a carefully folded piece of paper, and placed it on the table. She looked confused. What is this? It's the letter. The one where you forged my signature and rejected my scholarship. I had kept the copy for 20 years. The ink had faded, but the signature, the fake signature, was still there. She stared at it. Her hands began trembling. You remember now? She couldn't speak. For the first time in our lives, she had no excuses left. And she still hadn't seen the document waiting underneath it, a document that was about to reveal a truth so devastating that it would leave her speechless, and finally force my father to face the consequences of the words he'd spoken 20 years ago. My mother stared at the faded rejection letter as if it had become a ghost from her past. Her hands trembled so badly that she almost dropped it. I didn't think you'd keep this. I looked at her calmly. I kept every reminder of why I had to leave. She slowly lifted her eyes toward me. For the first time in my life, she looked ashamed. Not embarrassed. Not defensive. Ashamed. But 20 years of silence couldn't be erased by a single expression. I reached into my briefcase again. There was another document. I slid a thick folder across the table. She frowned. What's this? Open it. Inside were copies of every document connected to the loan they had taken out in my name. The forged signatures, the payment notices, the letters from the finance company, and finally, a court order from years earlier. She stared at it in confusion. I don't understand. You never knew? She slowly shook her head. No. I let out a slow breath. When I left for college, I hired a legal aid attorney through the university. They investigated everything. The signatures were proven to be forged. The loan was declared fraudulent. Her face went completely white. What? I wasn't responsible for a single rupee. She blinked rapidly. Then, the finance company came after the people who signed the documents. Her lips parted. No. Yes. They came after you and Dad. She covered her mouth. Your father told me he had handled everything. He did. He refinanced the house. He borrowed even more money. He paid off that loan to avoid criminal charges. She stared at me in horror. He never told me. I know. How? How do you know all this? Because my lawyer told me. I chose not to contact you. It wasn't my responsibility anymore. Tears rolled down her face. So, everything started because of us. No. Everything started because you believed Ethan deserved everything. She couldn't deny it, because she knew it was true. She whispered, we thought we were helping him. No. You were protecting him from consequences. There's a difference. Every failed exam, you rescued him. Every bad decision, you blamed someone else. Every debt, you paid it. You spent so many years making sure Ethan never faced the consequences of his actions, that he never learned responsibility. By the time he was 40, the world finally treated him like an adult, and he ran away. My mother cried quietly. People at nearby tables glanced over before politely looking away. She didn't seem to notice. I failed both my sons. Those words hung in the air. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Finally, I nodded. Yes, you did. Not because I wanted to hurt her, because it was true. She had failed Ethan by teaching him entitlement. She had failed me by teaching me I didn't matter. She looked up again. Your father wants to see you. I smiled sadly. Why? To apologize. Now? She nodded. He talks about you every day. I thought about the last words he'd spoken before I walked out of that house. People like you grow up to work for people like Ethan. Funny how time changes people. No, I replied. I don't think so. Her shoulders slumped. He isn't well. I'm sorry to hear that. I truly am. But illness doesn't erase choices. She reached into her purse and carefully unfolded an old photograph. It was from my high school graduation. I frowned. I didn't know anyone took pictures. She gave a weak smile. I did. The photo showed me standing alone outside the school auditorium, holding my diploma. In the background, my parents and Ethan were walking toward Ethan's soccer banquet instead of my graduation celebration. I was smiling in the picture, but now, 20 years later, I could see it. The smile wasn't real. I carried this for years, she whispered. I wanted to tell you. I'm sorry. Those 2 words. The words I had wanted to hear my entire childhood. They had finally arrived. 20 years too late. I folded the photograph and handed it back. I accept your apology. Her eyes widened with hope. But forgiveness doesn't erase consequences. She nodded slowly. I know. No, Mom. You really don't. I stood up from the table. I forgave you years ago. Not for your sake. For mine. I refused to let my anger control my life. She looked hopeful again. Then I finished my sentence. But forgiving someone doesn't mean inviting them back into your life. Her face fell. I placed enough cash on the table to pay for both coffees, then picked up my briefcase. As I turned to leave, she called my name. I stopped, without turning around. Please. Is this goodbye? I closed my eyes for a moment, then answered quietly, "It already was." I walked out of the cafe without looking back. I thought that was the end. I truly did. Until 3 days later, when my assistant walked into my office looking nervous. "Sir, there's an elderly couple downstairs. They refused to leave." I frowned. "Who are they?" She hesitated before answering. "They say they're your parents." And this time, my father had come in person. 3 days after my meeting with my mother, I was reviewing contracts in my office when my assistant, Sarah, knocked on the door. She looked uncomfortable. "Sir, there's an elderly couple in the reception area." I barely looked up. "Do they have an appointment?" "No." "Then ask security to escort them out." She hesitated. "They said they're your parents." My pen stopped moving. For several seconds, the room was silent. Finally, I sighed. "Bring them in." A minute later, the door opened. My mother walked in first. Behind her was my father. The man who had once seemed larger than life now leaned heavily on a cane. His shoulders were hunched. His hair was completely white. The confident, intimidating man from my childhood was gone. Age had caught up with him. So had the consequences of his choices. He looked around my office in complete disbelief. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city skyline. Awards lined one wall. Engineering patents and industry certificates covered another. On the shelf behind my desk sat the same dusty science trophy my parents had once thrown into the garage. I had polished it years ago. To everyone else, it was a small trophy. To me, it was proof that someone had believed in me before I believed in myself. My father's eyes locked onto it. He recognized it immediately. "So," he whispered, "you kept it." I nodded. Someone had to. His head slowly dropped. He looked around the office again. "I never imagined." "No," I interrupted. "You didn't. You told me I'd spend my life working for Ethan." The words hung in the air. He closed his eyes. "I know. No, I don't think you do." I stood and walked toward the large window. Without turning around, I continued. "I remember every word. You're not a leader. You'll never be successful. Your brother deserves everything. People like you work for people like Ethan. I spent years wondering if maybe you were right." My voice remained calm. "But every promotion, every project, every company I built, proved you were wrong." My father slowly sat in the chair across from my desk. He looked exhausted. "I came here to say I was sorry." I turned back to face him. "For what?" He opened his mouth, then closed it again. He couldn't answer, because there wasn't one thing to apologize for. There were thousands. Finally, he whispered, "For all of it." I pulled open a drawer. Inside was the old handwritten chore schedule my mother had given me when I was 12. The paper was yellow with age. I laid it on the desk. "Recognize this?" My mother covered her face. My father stared silently. "I kept this too. I wanted to remember what my childhood looked like." I pointed at the list. Morning dishes, laundry, bathrooms, lawn, cooking, cleaning. I looked directly at my father. "Tell me one chore Ethan had." He couldn't, because there weren't any. Then I placed another item on the desk. A framed newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Local entrepreneur donates 50 Indian rupees crore to create scholarships for underprivileged engineering students." My father looked confused. "You?" "I created a scholarship foundation." His eyes widened. "It pays for students whose families can't or won't support their education." My mother's lips trembled. "You named it." She noticed the title engraved beneath the frame. "The Mrs. Reynolds Opportunity Scholarship." I smiled softly. The woman who believed in me when my own parents didn't. Tears rolled down my mother's face. "I've helped hundreds of students. Some are doctors. Some are engineers. Some started businesses. They're succeeding because one person gave them the opportunity you took away from me." Neither of my parents spoke. There was nothing left to say. Finally, my father reached into his coat pocket. He removed a small cardboard box. "I think this belongs to you." I opened it. Inside was a tarnished gold medal. Took me a moment to recognize it. Then my heart skipped. It was the medal I had won at the regional science competition when I was 13. The one I thought had disappeared. "I found it in the garage," he said quietly. It had been buried under old paint cans. I cleaned it. I wanted to return it. I stared at the medal for a long time, then carefully placed it beside my old trophy. My father slowly stood. "We won't bother you again." His voice cracked. "I know we don't deserve forgiveness. We don't deserve your help. We just—" He looked around the office one last time. "Wanted you to know. You became everything we said you never would. For the first time in my life." He sounded proud. 20 years too late. As they reached the door, my mother turned around. "There is one last thing." "What is it?" "The landlord is evicting us next week." She didn't ask for money. She didn't ask for a place to stay. She simply stated the fact. Then they quietly walked out. I stood alone in my office for several minutes, staring at the closed door. I could afford to solve every problem they had with a single bank transfer. It wouldn't even make a dent in my finances. But the question wasn't whether I could. The question was whether I should. The answer would define not only the ending of their story, but the kind of man I had chosen to become. After my parents left my office, I stood in silence for a long time. The city stretched out beyond the windows. 20 years earlier, I had been a frightened 18-year-old carrying one backpack and a cardboard box. Now I owned the company whose logo was displayed on the building across the street. Life had a strange sense of humor. The boy they said would never succeed had built a life they never imagined possible. That night I barely slept. Not because I was angry, because I was thinking. There was a difference between revenge and becoming the kind of person I had spent my entire life trying to escape. My parents had spent decades rescuing Ethan from every consequence. I wasn't going to make the same mistake, but I also didn't want bitterness to make my decisions. The next morning I called my attorney. "I need you to find my parents." He nodded. "What would you like to do?" "I want to help." He smiled. "I thought you might." I held up a hand. "But not the way they expect." A week later, my parents were invited back to my office. They looked nervous. My father spoke first. "If this is about the apartment, we understand." I slid a folder across the desk. Inside was a legal agreement. My mother looked confused. "What is this?" "I bought the apartment building you're living in." Her eyes widened. "You, what?" "The new owner won't evict you." Tears immediately filled her eyes. "We can stay." "Yes." She reached across the desk. "I don't know how to thank you." I gently stopped her. "Read the rest." The agreement continued. Their rent would be reduced to a symbolic amount they could afford. The apartment could never be sold to them, could never be inherited by Ethan, and every payment would go directly into the scholarship foundation instead of my pocket. My father looked up. "So, we're paying for someone else's education?" I nodded. "Every month. Your rent will help another student get the opportunity one almost lost." For the first time in years, my father smiled. A small, sad smile. "I deserve that." "There are more conditions," I said. "No cash. I won't pay Ethan's debts. I won't send him money. If he ever contacts you asking for help, the answer is no." My mother quietly nodded. "We understand." "No. You finally learned." There was a difference. Several months passed. One Saturday morning, I attended the annual scholarship ceremony. More than 300 students filled the auditorium. Some came from poor families. Some had lost parents. Some had been told their dreams were impossible. They reminded me of myself. I stepped onto the stage. Behind me was a large banner. Mrs. Reynolds' Opportunity Scholarship. The audience applauded. I smiled. Then I noticed two familiar faces sitting quietly in the very last row. My parents. They hadn't come to see me. They had come because the foundation had invited every tenant whose rent helped support the program. For the first time in their lives, they watched students receive the opportunities they had once stolen from their own son. During my speech, I looked across the room. When I was young, I said, someone told me I'd never succeed. The room became silent. They said I wasn't a leader. They said I was born to support someone else. They were wrong. But this isn't a story about proving people wrong. It's about proving to yourself that someone else's opinion doesn't decide your future. I looked toward the back row. My parents both had tears running down their faces. I also learned something else. Success isn't measured by how much money you make. It's measured by how many doors you open for people after you've walked through one yourself. The audience stood and applauded. My parents remained seated, quietly crying. As everyone began leaving, my father slowly approached me. He held out his hand. I don't expect another chance. I just wanted to say, I'm proud of you. I looked at him for several seconds. Those were the words I had waited my entire childhood to hear. Strangely, they no longer had the power I thought they would. 'Cause I didn't need them anymore. I smiled politely. Take care of Mom. He nodded. I will. Then he turned and walked away beside the woman who had once chosen my brother over me every single day. A year later, I received a phone call. My father had passed away peacefully in his sleep. I attended the funeral, not because everything had been forgiven, but because carrying hatred forever would only keep me chained to the past. After the service, my mother handed me a small envelope. I found this in your father's desk. Inside was a single piece of paper. It was yellow with age. I recognized it immediately. It was my 4th grade report card. Straight A's. Across the top, in my father's handwriting, was a sentence that had never been shown to me. He's the smartest boy I've ever known. Below it was another line. I hope one day he forgives me for not knowing how to tell him. I stood there in silence. For years, I had believed he never saw me. Maybe he had. Maybe his pride, his favoritism, and his terrible choices had buried the love he never learned how to show. It didn't excuse what he had done, but it explained something I had wondered about for decades. Months later, my mother became one of the foundation's most dedicated volunteers. She spent her days organizing scholarship applications, greeting students, and quietly telling parents something she wished she had understood years earlier. Never compare your children. They're not competing for your love. Every time she said those words, she was really speaking to her younger self. On the 20th anniversary of the day I left home, I drove back to my childhood neighborhood. The old house was gone. A new family lived there. Children laughed in the front yard. I smiled. Some places deserve new memories. I got back into my car and drove away without looking back. This time, not because it hurt, but because there was nothing left behind worth carrying. The frightened boy who had once been treated like a servant was gone. In his place stood a man who had built a life defined not by revenge, but by resilience, kindness, and the courage to become everything he was told he could never be.